Good morning. You think you're ready for it, but you're not. Okay. All right, we're fresh back in the shop after our crazy last couple weeks. You guys have probably noticed in the videos. It's been 3 weeks, 3 weekends, 4 weekends in a row of non-stop events. 5? It's been 5. It's been 5. Non-stop events, rushing to get this thing done, to get that thing done, to get everything done. We haven't had a second to breathe. I finished the Porsche engine weeks ago, and we haven't been able to touch it because we've been so busy with everything else, which has broken my heart. So
finished it about 4 weeks ago.
Has it been that long? So today is my first day I could actually get to work on this thing again. We have been flat out non-stop, and so today I want to make the engine harness for this thing, because before this goes in, I want to make the engine harness out of the car. It's a lot easier, right? Because usually if it was in the car, I'm gonna have to work inside the trunk of this thing, the boot, the engine compartment. And so I'm gonna make the engine harness with the engine on the stand, and then we put it in and boom, it starts first try and everyone's happy and the car rips, right? That's theoretical. I have a day to do this. Like, we're gonna film this in one day, or else we're messed up on videos because we literally just got back from Wisconsin. So I think I'm gonna finish it, most of it. And this might not be no mil spec, like beautiful, like twist, like this isn't gonna be the nicest engine harness you've ever seen, but it's gonna work and it's gonna get me going. And really what I want to do is I want to use this kind of as the template for a harness, right? I want to get something on here that I think is gonna fit and gonna work. There's a lot of stuff I don't know about the car still that I'm kind of guessing in this harness. I haven't even had time to really dive in and research it. So we're gonna make this harness as stage 1. I'll probably end up pulling this thing back out and being able to like modify it from there, because it's easier to start once you already have a base. You guys know I hate redoing things, so
luckily this engine is very simple.
It's very simple. There's gonna be a lot of stuff on it, but it's very simple. I got this, right? Whatever. I spent all day yesterday trying to get everything to line up for this, and while I was doing that, Spoon was working on his car, and he's got quite the update for you guys.
It's been non-stop on those two. I'm over it. I don't want to touch them. I don't want to see them. I don't want to see Jimmy right now. It's been non-stop, so I finally took some time to work on this thing. If you remember, right before we left for Virginia, my cage kit came in. So I spent all day yesterday cleaning. Honestly, it took longer to clean everything and prep everything than actually mock everything up.
Look at this.
Cage kits, you can't go wrong. Like, it's the best for a reason. It's easier than that IKEA dresser your girl conned you into doing.
Those things are tricky, I'll tell you what. So cage kit cage, you guys know we've talked about before. They are pre-fabbed, or they're pre-bent, laser etched.
No, they are laser scanned, computer engineered,
pre-bent, pre-etched, ready to go installation cages. We put it in E36. The cage was dumb tight.
It's so good.
We got one for Spoon's FRZ and
A6. Get it right. Put some respect on it.
Look how tight this thing fits. I didn't like it from far away. You can't even tell there's a cage in it. So Spoon mocked it up last night. He got it all tacked into place, which is actually wow. That's a
yeah, I got all the major sections. The main hoop is tacked together. The front half is tacked together, and the back section is kind of tacked together.
It fits in there so nice. It like doesn't even feel like it's like any lack of room. You know what I mean? Like the car chassis doesn't feel any more cramped.
Yeah, you leave door bars for last.
Are you going
save
like
yourself the head?
NASCAR style? Or are you gonna keep them simple like my cars?
I'm gonna use the door bars this time.
Okay, that's nice. Usually I was expecting Spoon to like gut the doors and put like quadruple uprights coming out.
I'm trying to keep myself tame. Like, it's still going overboard, but I'm trying to find that balance of efficiency.
Yeah, he don't know balance.
Jimmy don't know it, but I'm working on all this today.
I'll be twisting wires and he'll be
welding,
tacking beads. Yeah. Spoon's trying to knock out the chassis stuff now because we have basically the whole drivetrain for us. So once the chassis stuff's knocked out, it's just boom, easy. Well, whatever. We swapped an LS in 4 days. We can do this. All right, so let's get to making the harness for this thing. And I usually like to give you guys as much information as I can. This one's gonna be a little bit of a scatterbrain mess because I'm just throwing wires at it because I want this damn thing to run before we leave for Canada, because we leave for Canada in like 10 days or something like that.
That's the deadline.
Yeah. Oh. Because once I leave for Canada, I come back and I'm gone for like a month.
Where are you going?
We'll talk about that later on. But I need to get the Porsche running because I need to drive this thing. So what are we starting with, right? We're gonna start with a Link Fury. This isn't a Link Fury, it hasn't come in yet. This is our Golden Fury that we won in 2021. But this is what a Link Fury looks like, just not gold. The Link Fury is my favorite ECU. The amount of IOs, the amount of inputs and outputs it offers, while also housing an internal wideband, you can't beat it. So this is what we're gonna use. And then to make our life nice and easy, we're gonna start with Link's A-loom and B-loom 2.5 meters long, right? But essentially what it is it's the plug for both sides, plug A and plug B, and it gives you 2.5 meters of flying leads off of every pin on the ECU.
What's a meter?
What's a meter? Good question. What the f is a kilometer? Oh, where do we start? Let's go plan. Let's go figure this out. Well, first off, it's way too damn hot out, so we're bringing this thing into the office. All right, here's our workstation for the day. Also, we haven't plugged yet, which is wild. So, if you guys haven't seen on Instagram, Adam, LZ, and I have finally done our first collab drop. It has been many, many years in the making. We finally found some time to piece something together, and I think we did something pretty cool. So, on the website, right now, we have a very limited batch left after the Instagram drop of LZMFG/Oaks Garage collab tees. We got, what? 1 t-shirt, 1 hoodie, 2 banners.
Banners are gone. Really? Banners are gone? Yes.
That was impressive. All right, well, all we have is hoodies and t-shirts left. We'll bang them right here on the screen. Ready? Yeah, these things are good. So, if you guys want to copy yours, hop below, shop to Mio, and copy yourself a LZMFG/O. That was good, right? All right, so I'm gonna try and not over-explain anything. I want to keep this short and simple, and hopefully you can still get some stuff out of it. I did do a video prior, I'll Austin find it, where I went a little bit more in depth, but I'll try and give you some details, right? So where I like to start when starting to plan a harness is the Link ECU comes with, we'll call it the quick start guide, right? And it gives you a list of all the inputs and outputs on the ECU, right? So it tells you what type of input or output it is. It gives me a blank space, and it kind of tells me a little bit about those inputs and outputs on the side, right? So what I like to do is fill this out almost like a spreadsheet of what I need and where it's gonna go. And then once I know what I need and where it's gonna go, I start running some wires, right? So let's talk about it. What's the first thing that we need, Austin? Should we just run down the whole damn list? Trigger 1 and trigger 2, right? Trigger 1, crank angle sensor, already just it, right? But since we're no longer running a distributor, I added a cam sensor, so we also need trigger 2 for a cam sensor. So for trigger 2, we'll add cam sensor. Now, if you look down the list, we're gonna be running into the analog temp inputs, right? So this is gonna be like our resistor temp sensors, right? So if you ever see like a temp sensor that has 2 wires, you know, it's like a resistor-based sensor, that is what we're gonna be shoving there. 1, coolant, oh wait, we don't have a coolant temp sensor, it's a Porsche. So we're gonna use the head temp sensor, right? Because it comes with a head temp sensor, and then we're gonna be using an intake air temp sensor, and then an oil temperature sensor. Now we can move down the list, and we have our analogs, right? So our analogs is a sensor that basically utilizes a 5-volt reference, right? So what it does is it's some type of sensor that takes that 5 volts and variates it, and then that variation of 5 volts is then scaled to something, right? So say you have a map sensor, right? It'll use pressure to scale that. It'll take that 5-volt reference and scale it to a map, right? So say we have a 3-bar map. So we'll say at 5 volts, you're hitting 3 bars. At 0 volts, you're at 0 PSI, and then you scale that between the two. That's how the computer knows the pressure. Let's see what we have for 5-volt analog sensors. Map sensor, very important. Since we're not running a mass airflow sensor, we need to be running speed density. Ooh, speaking of TPS, if we wanted to run alpha N, oil pressure. Could run fuel pressure if we wanted to. This one I'm not gonna be running a digital fuel pressure gauge on it, so we're gonna just leave that with the map, TPS, and oil pressure. That's all really need for this setup. It's gonna be pretty simple. But what's nice is we have a bunch of extra analogs open if we wanna add sensors in the future, right? We're gonna come down, and you can see our next bit is ignition, right? We have 6 outputs for ignition, and well, good thing this is a 6-cylinder. That's what we got, right? These are already defined, right? We don't get to mark this down. Coil 1 goes ignition 1, coil 2 goes ignition 2, and vice versa. And then coming down the list, you can see we also have injection 1 through 8, because there's 8 possible injector outputs. It's a 6-cylinder. We're gonna utilize the first 6 of the injectors, and so those are already to be spoken for, right? You got that, RJ?
Sorry, are you talking to me?
Yeah, whatever, dude. So now we're gonna move on to another big one, and that is our auxiliary outputs. Dun, dun, dun. Auxiliary outputs, right? So we were just talking about analogs that work on a 5-volt reference. Auxiliary works in a 12-volt setting, right? Uses all 12 volts. What an auxiliary output does is it basically, it'll be more like a switch than a sensor reading, right? So instead of reading a varying voltage, it's basically an on or off situation. We'll consider an aux basically just on or off, right? So this is something that we would use to trigger something like mainly relays we'd see being triggered, or operate something with a pulse like a boost controller to pulse a valve in a Mac valve and control your boost, right? These you end up using pretty quickly. So let's see what we're gonna be using. So aux1 boost controller. But wait, Jimmy, it's not boosted yet. On top of that, it's something that you could use to control your VTC or VVTi, right? You could pulse the VVTi unit to create the swing and variable cam position, or the VTC, just trigger it for the max swing of the VTC gear. You could trigger VTEC with this. Anything that needs to be switched on or off, an aux. Since an aux is used to commonly control relays, having your fuel pump relay and your fan relay controlled by your ECU via an aux is very important, right? Don't put things on switches. Your ECU can handle it. It's more stuff you got to think about. Keep it easy, right? So we don't have a coolant fan, but we do have a fan for our oil cooler. I don't know if that is actually ran through the ECU or through the chassis on the Porsche. That one still stressed me out. I have to figure it out. But I'm going to put this aux on here just in case, and we can have the flying lead, and that's stuff I still need to figure out later on, but we're going to put it in the harness. So we're going to put fan relay control, and we do need to add a fuel pump relay control because the ECU does control the fuel pump in the Porsche, right? This one's pretty simple. I don't think we have to add anything beyond that. All right, psych, we have a idle air control valve, right? Most IACs are just a pulsed valve to control airflow into the engine. That's definitely going to be an aux. All right, what else we got? NOx sensors. Yeah, we don't need those. So now we're moving on to one of the next major pieces, and that is a digital input. Dun, dun, dun. What's a digital input, right? So unlike an analog input where it's a 5-volt input, digital inputs are 12-volt inputs, right? So it's something that does read a varying voltage in terms of like a sensor, but off of 12 volts versus 5. All right, makes sense? Cool. So what works as a digital input, right? So flex fuel, right? So ethanol content sensor will be a 12 volt, right? So we're gonna put flex fuel in here so we can put ethanol on this thing because we're gonna boost it and it'll love ethanol. On top of that, speed sensor. We don't have VVTi position or anything like that. It's a very simple engine. That's all we should really need. Yeah. And coming down the rest of the list, we have the IOs for the internal wideband, right? So we'll be wiring this into a Bosch 4.9 sensor, so we don't have to add an extra wideband controller or CAN lambda. It'll be right in the harness, right to the ECU, because knowing our AFRs is one of the most important tools in tuning a vehicle. So we wrote down what we need, which really isn't much. It's a very simple engine. We don't really have too much going on. So now that we know what we need, well, we can start planning out the harness. So we know where the engine's gonna mount and how it's gonna mount, right? That's why we have the whole thing in there to use as a template for the engine harness, but we have to figure out where the ECU is gonna be mounting because that's where all the wires meet. In the Porsche, this thing's a little wonky, right? Because the engine is back here. The engine harness wraps around twice, and then they put the ECU forgot. It's either in the floorboard or it's in the front bay. We've been so busy, guys. Either way, the factory ECU is up here, engine's back there. The engine harness now is 2 different harnesses that integrate into the chassis, then reintegrate into the ECU. It's a pain in the ass. I wasn't able to find all the information I needed, so I'm gonna go out on a whim here and kind of do it my own way, right? I'm gonna try and make this engine harness pretty standalone, and then gradually integrate it into the chassis harness as we pull it off the lift and have time to figure out where everything is. Instead of trying to shove the ECU all the way up to the front and running all those wires to the front, I decided to switch things up a bit, and this might not be the best way to do it, right? But this is why I said before that I think this is kind of rendition number 1 of this engine harness. I'm kind of in open waters right now, and I'm gonna be just trying new things, right? So I might have to remake this engine harness in a few months. I don't care. It's a learning experience, and honestly, this stuff is all pretty cheap to do. So I want to mount the ECU actually in the engine compartment itself, right? The Link ECUs, they're not waterproof, but they're water resistant. I can't submerge the thing in water, but a little bit of moisture is not going to kill the thing. And honestly, these things stay pretty dry back here. So I'm going to be mounting my ECU somewhere in here. I think I have a good spot. I think if we remove the factory coils right here, since we won't be utilizing them, the ECU will mount really, really nice right here. Yeah, easy peasy. And you pop the band, you see that nice juicy Link Fury.
Bracket in the engine.
Yeah. So all of this right here, these coils, we can actually get rid of them. So we don't need this. Right next to our fuse box, everything will be really tight and knit. And then when we need to send wires to the front of the car, we could use this right here because this is what goes into the chassis. So now that I think makes things easy. So when we need to guess our wire length, well, we know the ECU is gonna be right about here. Right here, right? You want to hold this the whole time so I have a... We don't need too many wires. We can kind of keep everything segregated to the back and bring it right here. This should keep things pretty easy. And then we can integrate it to our fuse box right here and then to our chassis right here. Science. I'm gonna jump straight into playing with some wires here. So we have our A, we got our B loom, and then we have our IO list of both connectors that is on our website, Link's website, the startup guide. Really easy to find. So this will tell us exactly where each wire goes and what each wire means. Get it out of the way. We can always add it back in if we forget something, because I probably forgot. I definitely forgot something. If we could thin it out now, it makes the whole process feel way less overwhelming. So let's figure out what we don't need and pull those wires out. 2.5 meters. All right. That's a lot of wires. So this is color coordinated, which makes things a lot easier, but usually, obviously, 98% of the time when you read pinouts, it's from the back like this. Like this is how we're reading it. Not this, because your brain would want to tell you that it's this. But like this. So the Link one's easy, right? So you just pop this. And then you could just, let's see, injector 8. We don't got that. Get rid of that. Temp 4. We're not using that. You guys don't gotta hear me do this every time, but you get the gist. And then to lock it back in, we just push those down. Boom. So we're not using a lot on the B loom. We'll be using more on the A loom, so you could tell look how much we simplified it. So on the A loom, you can tell we're utilizing most of it. So we do have quite a few wires to run today. But for now, I'm curious. I wonder how Spoon's doing.
All right, now that the major sections are all fit and kind of mocked in place, I planned it to weld it in 3 major sections. So the entire main hoop will come out, weld all this up on the bench, weld up the rear crossbar, which is just sitting here, outside of the car, and then this I will lay down, weld all this up, and then all 3 together, weld it. Should go pretty quick. First thing first, we'll move the other stuff and just get the main hoop out of here. Lay the back side. That was just some shit like tacks. It's all good. The front, I know I tacked a little bit better. Same thing with the main hoop. Now one day I'll have a nice big fab table with all the little jigs and clamps, but for now we make do.
There's also a good time to make another disclaimer that there is 1.5 million better ways to make a harness more efficiently, and I am doing with what I have right now. This is kind of like the day before jet event type of harness that we're making. In the harness, we have our wires for our inputs and outputs, right? On top of that, you need to have your power in the harness, right? So you need to power your sensors, your coils, your injectors, and you also have to ground everything, right? I am gonna focus on the power circuit aspect of it after. What I wanna do first, and this might not be the most efficient bit, but it's just what's on my brain right now, I wanna run all my wires to the sensors that need to be there, and then I'll use that to pull off, and that will give me the length and the fitment of the harness, and then we could do the power section on the bench. I'm gonna put this right here. I'm gonna start running the wires and try to zip tie them into an order that makes sense to flow on the engine, and then we'll pull it off from there. let's neglect these wires for now. We'll talk about that later on. So for now, the B loom is ran, right? It looks like a mess and it looks overwhelming, but as wires go, it gets more simple and it looks normal, right? I kind of use the zip ties to kind of hold the harness in place, to kind of hold the length that I want in position. So the one thing is the wideband. Don't really know where I want to put it yet, so we're gonna leave that on the longer side. But besides that, we have some type of order here. Now the B loom is the small one. Now we're gonna do the A loom, which is gonna get a lot more chaotic, but just be patient and take your time. So enjoy the time lapse. It's something. It might not look like something, but it's something. A lot was figured out. As you could tell, this is why I wanted to do this out of the car. Because if I had to do this in the car, obviously, this would...
That would have been a nightmare.
That would have been a nightmare, yeah. So, using zip ties is my best friend, just kind of routing everything where it wants to go, trying to cluster as much as possible while kind of branching off where wires need to go, right? This was really for me to really find out the routing and the wire length. Obviously, there's more efficient ways of doing this. You can make boards, this, and this. This was the easiest way for me, and so we got most of the wires figured out. The rest, I could now cut off the engine, put it on there, and we could kind of figure it out from there. I'm gonna leave some things a little bit too long. Maybe some things might be on the short side. Most likely they're gonna be too long. I always tend to be longer with it, and I'd rather it be too long than too short, right? But the overall direction is here, right? Kind of feel like a barber and a surgeon, like.
And a mechanic.
And an electrician. Yeah, an electrician and. A handsome YouTuber. I'm kidding. Let's get this thing off on the table and then we'll go to our next step. All right, it's looking like something. So now that we have all our wires that are going to all the connectors for all the sensors, inputs and outputs, there's no power in the harness, right? We need power to the sensors. It needs power for reference, it needs power to turn things on, it needs power to turn the ECU on, and so we could either start pinning the connectors and then adding the power later, or we could add the power, which I'll call the vanes, now and then pin later. So I usually have a really good plan for these things and then like come to the video. This one I'm free balling. So I'm thinking what I'm gonna do is I'm going to, you see our leads right here, right? How I just have leads, right? A lot of these need power going to them too, right? So I think what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just throw a wire with them and just let it run in the harness, and we're gonna group it up and see where they tie together, where we can actually splice them together since it's gonna be the same power source, and see where it wants to organically lay, and then we'll start doing some splicing. Sound good, Steve?
Sounds good, Professor Oaks.
So we're gonna start with our 5 volt. Your whole power system in your car is 12 volt, right? Some sensors require 5 volt, which means the ECU actually has to regulate that, so the ECU gives out the 5 volt, so it comes right out of the harness. So we have 2 wires in here for a 5 volt reference, and we just have to run these to our 5 volt sensors. So what we got for a 5 volt sensor, if you look at our sheet here, we got the map sensor, the TPS, we got the oil pressure sensor, right? So we just have to make sure those go to that. So TPS and map are right next to each other. So we're gonna run all the wires there, oil pressure sensor, which is right here. So let's zip tie that together, and then we're gonna split this right here and share the 5 volt to the TPS and the map sensor in the front. So when it comes to splicing wires, everyone has their own technique. Some guys like just twisting and sending it. Some guys like solder, and then I like uninsulated butt connectors, right? Just like crimps. The more research I did, you know, the solder fatigue's pretty bad, right? If you ever use with solder, if there's any movement in it, it'll break. And that doesn't tend to last very long in automotive because these harnesses are, you know, they move a lot, they have a lot of heat getting to them. So just like a nice uninsulated butt connector, crimp it. If you take apart most OEM harnesses, they will have just a crimped butt connector like this, and then I'll take some heat shrink, right? And then we'll insulate it with the heat shrink. Take spoons lighter. Heat gun works nicely too. So now we have a 5 volt for our TPS, 5 volt for our map sensor, and the 5 volt for our oil pressure. Perfect. so we did 5 volt, and now it's time to run the rest of the power system in here, which is gonna be the 12 volt, right? So there's actually a lot in the harness that requires 12 volts, so this one's gonna make the harness a little bit more dense, and well, we got some things to do. So, I marked off with the blue tape everywhere that needs to get a switched 12 volt source, right? So we got the main stuff, like the injectors and the coils. Those are gonna be like the 2 highest probably load source. And we're gonna have the things like the idle air control valve. We have even our sensors, like our cam and crank sensors are 12 volt. Flex fuel is 12 volt. We have our Y band that's 12 volt. There's a lot of things that are 12 volt. And if you're ever questioning about this stuff, you could always look up the pinouts to most of these connectors. Most of this stuff is pretty obtainable. Most coils, you could always find the pinouts. Injectors are always switch 12 and an ECU trigger. The stuff like the Y band and stuff like that, it's all common sensors. That's very easy to look up information. So if you're curious, if you need 12 volt source before you run your power harness, Google your pinouts, right? It's not the most efficient, but it's gonna make my life easier in terms of thinking right now. Is I'm gonna run a wire from each leg forward, and I'm gonna tie them together and see how I could bridge it into each other, so we can kind of simplify the line by splicing it in, going to the front, right? Use a thicker wire for the coils and the injectors, and try to keep that on its own system. And then the rest of the sensors, stuff like that, since it's a low draw, I'll use thinner wire and we can kind of tie those all together. Boom. Now all of the power wires are done between 5 volt and 12 volt. So we have literally everything running out to these 4 wires right here, right? So everything that needs to be powered, from the power that needs to go to the ECU to turn it on, to the power that needs to go to the coils, the power that needs to go to the injectors, the power that needs to go to the IAC, everything in the harness is right here. Everyone does this differently, right? So the way I like to do it is I like to relay the harness on its own relays and then trigger that by the chassis. Sometimes you could have the chassis turn the ECU on, you can have the ECU turn the relays on, you could have the run it invert, it doesn't matter. This is just what works for me. So I will be running these for 2 and 2. I'm gonna be running these to 2 different relays. I'm gonna split up the load source and then have that triggered by the chassis. And when the chassis turns on switch power via the key, it'll turn the ECU on, the coils on, everything in the harness on. So we're gonna hold this off to the side for now. We're not gonna worry about that because we are not done running wires just yet. We've done sensor wires, we've done power wires. Now Steve, what is next?
Give me that so I can sound smart. I think we need a ground.
There you go. See?
Right.
That wasn't me. That wasn't me.
I got no heads.
So there's basically 2 types of grounds. There's a clean ground, there's a clean ground and a dirty ground. We have 2 different types of ground, right? We have a sensor ground and we have a just like a normal ground, right? So sensor grounds, it's just a cleaner ground signal. So you tend to use them through the resistant type sensors, right? So basically our temperature sensors at a resistor bait, right? 2 wire temperature sensors, right? So we have our head temp, which is 2 wire, we have an intake air temp, which is 2 wire, and we have an oil temp sensor, which is just 2 wires. For those, we are going to be using the sensor ground, which Link gives us quite a few actually in the harness in the flying leads one. So see all these green wires right here? These are all sensor grounds. So I'm gonna run these, cut some more zip ties, damn it, and bring them to our wires that are our intake air, where the f intake air temp sensor? Intake air temperature sensor, head temperature sensor, and then oil temperature sensor. I also forgot the flex fuel sensor and the speed sensor. If it has a sensor in it, it says ground, put a sensor ground to it. Honestly, you could probably get away with a dirty, like a regular dirty ground, but I didn't say that. I didn't though. Everything has green at the sensor ground. It's almost, we're almost there. Oh, I forgot to do a tack output. But it's good, it's fine. I think we have everything that's gonna be on the engine. We could always pin off of the ECU into the chassis. That's why I said rendition number 1. I decided to make an engine harness this morning at 9 AM, so bear with me. Now we have our little dirty grounds, I'll call them. your IAC, right? It's not really a sensor, it just needs a ground to actuate the little electric engine. You can run that in, electric engine, little, you know, actuator. Jesus, long day. You definitely need a sensor ground for your trigger 1 and trigger 2, but that's already pinned into the harness for us, which is really nice. Do I look like a mess or do I look like I got this?
You mix both. I feel like you look like you got this under control.
Yeah, we're good. This seems too simple. Like, I feel like there's more. Here's the thing, right? So we have things that are going to communicate to the chassis, right? Which is mainly going to be stuff for the cluster. We're going to have the tach, we're going to have the factory oil temperature sensor, the factory oil pressure sensor. We're going to need starter trigger, that's all coming off the chassis. That is essentially those wires that I have hanging on the engine right there, right? So those don't even go to the ECU. Those go straight from the engine into the chassis harness, straight to the cluster. The tach actually does come out of the ECU. That's why I said, shit, I'm missing the tach wire, but it's one wire. So we will be making a chassis interface section of wires, kind of over here. This is stuff that I'm gonna have to communicate to the chassis later on once I figure out where it is in the chassis. That we could put on a generic Deutsch connector and make a flying lead from that. That stuff on the engine right now is the stuff that goes straight to the fuse box plug that goes to the cluster, right? So that we can kind of like wrap up and run separately. So I think we have just about everything ran. We have our grounding wire. So this is like, I'll call it our dirty grounds, right? So this is the grounds that aren't filtered at all. I'm gonna branch these into 2 sections, put like a ring terminal on them, and we're gonna bolt this somewhere on the engine because the ECU needs to be grounded and it needs these to ground all the circuits on the rest of the ECU. Very important. Now, all the wires are in. It is officially time to either loom or pin the connectors, right? This is a really, really important step, right? Looming a harness is the difference between it looking really cool or looking really shit, right? If you loom it really great, it looks like $1 million harness, right? If you loom it really bad, even if it's made really nice, it's gonna look like junk. For the system like this, especially since it's our first edition harness, we're just gonna test tape this thing. OEM does it. It's basically a Volkswagen anyways, so we're just gonna test tape it. I don't hate it. Also, it's easy if we have any complications to kind of cut the test tape back and rewrap it and it blends right in. So, Steve, should I pin it first or should I tape it first? Since we're taping it, it doesn't really matter.
Since you're taping it, it doesn't really matter. We cut to that.
I'm gonna start taping this up. You wanna do me a favor? Go make sure Spoon hasn't died of heat stroke yet.
Make sure he's still alive.
Make sure he's still alive.
Laugh at my misery. This is the part that I've been most excited for, and it's gotta be the hottest week of the year.
Test tape is like the most legit, awesome way of just copping out on sleeving a harness.
Audi, Volkswagen, I believe Lamborghini do all the
Same shit on it.
Test tape, baby.
They use that factory?
Yeah.
Getting some really nice loom will make your shit look official.
Yeah.
But I'm telling you, it probably takes more time. I mean, I suck at it. It takes more time to probably loom a whole harness properly than it does to like do anything else.
Feed it through that like Chinese finger trap looking shit. Right?
Yeah, you gotta plan it. You gotta really plan it. You gotta
Yeah,
like
where
be
all your intersections are, you gotta heat it. So
very strategic.
that's the tape for the win.
That's the tape for the win. Look at this thing.
OEM fresh.
They'll never know.
I know.
Oh, they know. It's mainly taped up, right? It cleaned up really good, and it makes it look a lot less overwhelming. There's no like sexy splits, right? Like, the thing that's nice about the test tape is you don't have to do these branch splits where they all kind of come in one spot. Like, I think that kind of looks nicer when you kind of bring them all in one spot, but honestly, I like to leave them separate like this because it makes tucking and moving the harness a lot easier. So now we have to pin all the wires, right? So we have just these bare wires, and we have to pin these to a connector so we could plug them into something, right? You could get pins in 1 or 2 ways. You can get them with flying leads, so it's a connector that has wires already coming out of it, and then you splice the wires in. Some people like that because it's a lot easier to just crimp butt connectors and go, but I think it takes longer and it's more work than actually just getting the bare connector and getting the pin itself that we have to crimp in and push in. A lot of guys have a hard time finding connectors, right? If you can't find one, you could just cut it off the old harness and splice it in. Whatever, I'm not gonna hold it against you. But wiringspecialties.com, they sell a lot of OEM connectors, and a lot of them are used between manufacturers. Like, you might have to go on there and just scroll by like pin count, but at the end of the day, Most of these sensors are not made by the manufacturer, made by a third-party manufacturer like Bosch and Mitsubishi or whatever, and they all kind of buy from each other. So a lot of them are common and very, very easy to find, especially things like injectors, right? Interchangeable, right? Like even like cam angle sensors, you'd be surprised how common those plugs are, right? Do your due diligence, get some plugs, and you'll be good. So for now, what we're gonna do is we go through and pin everything up. If you don't know what your pinout is, I said it before, all this information is heavily on the internet. What's the pinout for a cam angle sensor for a 1992 Miata, right? Boom, that's gonna come up everywhere. You could pull up the OEM manual if you need to, but like I said, most of this information is pretty damn common. So for now, I'm just gonna start pinning things and hope I bought all the right connectors. So, wish me luck. This is a moment when you realize what connectors you forgot to order, right? So most of it's pinned up. We have the injectors on both sides. We have a couple of the sensors, and it's starting to actually look like a harness. As you can see, there's still some bare wires. We have the grounds, we have the main power wires for the relay on the harness, then we have the flying leads to the chassis, and then two connectors I did not have the connectors for. No big deal. You're probably wondering, Jimmy, you have 12 smart coils on that engine. Where the heck is that in the engine, right? That's a lot of plugs. I pre-made those. Look at these little coil harnesses, right? So I have the coil from the harness on a Deutsch connector, and yes, it's a 8-pin Deutsch connector. I should have a 4, but that's what I had in the bin. So I made these module, right? So we could just take this and we could just plug this in. Boom. And that's our coil harness right there. And the harness gets that much bigger. But wait, there's more. Another coil harness. These alone took hours, but they're here, right? Boom. Right here. So I'm still not convinced that we need all 12 coils, but that's something that I want to test on the dyno once the engine's together. I feel like the lower coils we can get rid of, but couldn't find any good information on that, so I'm going to find the information myself by testing on the dyno. Sound good? Stay tuned for that. So now the harness looks chunky, right? It's getting there. And I still can consider a pretty simple setup. The last thing I want to do is we have to make my spots for the grounds, right? We need the grounds for the coil pack harness since I have them grounded separately. We have the main grounds for the engine harness, and then I have my power wires for the main harness, right? So before I cut those to length, I think we should test fit the entire harness on the engine, see how it looks, see how we did, cut our grounds, and then call it quits, call it victory. What's the term for that? It's early, it's the next day. We gotta get this video out in like an hour or so. Let's get this harness on, ready? Boom. I like that you can't see it on the front of the engine. So in the back over here, we have it. It looks a little chaotic, but it's nice to see things plugged in. We have our coils plugged in, our injectors plugged in. The back of it is chaotic. Of course, ECU connector on this side, which will be on the chassis. Like we said before, this is my boost controller and flex shield sensor. I still don't really know where I want to put these just yet, so that's why I didn't really pin them. And then this is our main powers for the relay, right? So we have a power to the relay, power out to the harness, and all we need to do is find a switch source on the chassis to turn this on, which will turn the whole harness on. Now you're probably wondering, where did I get power for the harness, right? This is like the easiest spot to do it. My starter, right? Your starter will always get a constant 12-volt source, and it of course comes on a very thick wire, so it's ready for the rated amps. So I'm gonna put a ring on the wire that goes to the relay and right to the starter. Boom, just like a little cheat code. Just like that. Now it's not dependent on the chassis for getting a constant 12 source. It's coming off literally from the starter. Now the last thing I want to talk about is all these wires right here that you guys have been seeing throughout the entire video. And you're like, Jimmy, what the hell are you doing? That looks crazy, right? So when we put the alternator in, we had to actually wire the alternator before we can install it. It was kind of quite the pain in the ass. So of course I didn't want to not be able to install the alternator because it's like the whole fan assembly on the engine. So These are these are the wires that go to the alternator to communicate to the chassis, right? We have the alternator power wire that's going to go to the starter, right? Because they both need to be attached to the vehicle's main charging source or main power source. You have a couple grounds, basically the resistor that communicates to the alternator to turn it on, and this all plugs into the chassis, not to the ECU, right? So I just literally ripped these out of the factory harness. Felt kind of bad about it, but whatever. I have to clean this up and tape it, and what we'll be doing is literally just taping this in the harness, just like this, and this will plug right into the chassis. So there's really not much thinking there. I just have to do some more taping, and we're good to go. Now, I got some wire management to get over. Got to bolt on some grounds and wire the relay in, and we should be good to go. Well, before we end the video, let's go see how much Spoon got done.
What's up?
You laid a lot of welds already.
Yeah, the whole front half is all welded together.
This is crazy. It's crazy how much cooler a chassis gets once there's a cage in it.
So fast.
So fast. Spoon decided to go with the door bars that the cage came with, and they look sick in here.
Looks so good.
The little uprights and stuff in it. Spoon officially getting after it. Once the cage is done, almost all the major modification on the chassis are basically gone, besides like the pedal box and the small stuff. But that's all small stuff. So
the cage and then cutting the quarters.
The cage and then cutting the quarters, but cutting the quarters, that ain't it. So, sorry. Spoon's been working his ass off, but it really shows you that the cage kit cage really come ready to go. I mean, I didn't see you have to really modify any tubes at all, and the fitment on that.
The longest part is literally prepping the chassis.
To getting all the paint and seam sealing stuff off to weld the plates on that the kit comes with, it slips in and you weld. There's no, it's more grunt work than thinking.
If you're halfway decent at MIG welding, you can do this yourself.
Or if you want to attempt MIG welding and you're patient.
Yeah.
Dude, we said before, the cage kits are
phenomenal.
Phenomenal. You can't, there's nothing on the market that even compares to it. It's like one of those things that it's like really worth saying the buy once, cry once. Yeah. Because it makes up for it indefinitely in the end. So
please go thank Cage Kits for me, and just not only me, just everything they do for the drift community.
They offer so much to the drift community by offering so many different chassis at so many cages at such a fair price. That's something that you could have something beautiful in your own garage.
Yeah, and it's a high level chassis kit. Like, it's not your average
in the middle of the mall.
Yeah, no.
In the middle of the mall. So there you go, boys. I'm gonna go finish up that harness. Austin's gonna finish up this video. Spoon's gonna finish up this cage, and we're gonna get back to it. So if you don't want to do what I did, just go on wiringspecialist.com and buy a harness. If they made a Porsche one, I probably would have did it. But for now, I hope
start developing a Porsche one.
Yeah, I should have just called Earl. But for now, I hope you guys get a kick out of it. And you know the deal. Like, comment, subscribe. Stay tuned for more content. And Spoon,
have a wonderful night.